Eguerdion, ongi etorri bigarren eztabaida mahai honetara, Lenin eta Hegelen logikaren zientzia. Jakin ezazue hitzaldia guztiz ingelesez izango dela. Welcome to this second panel discussion of the conference, Lenin and Hegel's Science of Logic. We are joined by Professor Kevin B. Anderson, who will present his paper, Lenin and Hegel, or Dialectics, National Liberation and Revolution. Anderson is an American sociologist, professor of sociology, political science, and feminist studies at University of California. He was involved in the international project of the complete works of Marx and Engels. He's the author of two major works, Marx at the Margins on Nationalism, Ethnicity, and Non-Western Societies, recently translated into Spanish by Verso Books, and that he has been recently presenting in Barcelona, Salamanca, or Madrid. We have also his work on Lenin, Hegel, and Western Marxism, in which he addresses some of the issues that interest us here today. In a context of political, economic, and military global upheaval, the engagement with Hegel's logical abstractions seems, at the very least, an exercise in pedantry and frivolity. This is, however, what Lenin himself did in the midst of the World War. At the time when the European working class was in the middle of a bloodbath and the socialist movement in an unprecedented bankruptcy, Lenin confined himself in the library to study the classics of Western philosophy in detail. He was especially focused in Hegel and his central philosophical work, The Science of Logic. Paradoxical as it may seem, for Lenin, confining himself to the library was not a way of renouncing the political struggle in order to abandon himself to a sort of contemplative life. On the contrary, the science of logic was to provide a broader, deeper, and more radical perspective that would allow for a rethinking of political action in such a turbulent context. In the 20th century, both historically and philosophically, the 20th century, both historically and philosophically, represents a kind of reactionary, reformist, and even a postmodern rebellion against Hegel and the rationalist core of his philosophy. But Hegel has resisted, and his philosophy lives on, especially in the ranks of organized communism. Communists continue to find in Hegel the inspiration to think about the present and its challenges. That is why we have invited today Kevin B. Anderson. I would not want to close this presentation without sending a warm greeting to Helena Sihan, who, for personal reasons, is unable to join us today. And for this reason, instead of two presentations and a final debate, there will be only one presentation and a series of questions from my side. Well, that's all from my side, and the floor is yours, Kevin, so when you want.
Thank you, Alex. I want to begin with a different type of thank you, because I really need to be thankful to the people of this region, especially a little further away to Pamplona, because in 1944, my father came to Pamplona and he almost was dying. He was very sick, and we learned about the value of the caregivers during the COVID pandemic. But the caregivers of Pamplona actually saved my father's life, and that's why 4 years later I was able to be born. So I want to thank, but it's not a general thank you. It's also a specific circumstance, which is the fight against fascism and Nazism, because my father was there because he was part of a plane that was bombing Germany, and the plane was shot in France, and then for 6 weeks he had to survive in France with the help of the resistance and with the Gestapo trying to catch him, and then to come over the Pyrenees into Spain. And by that time he was very, very sick, So this is how my father survived and how I was able to be born. So I want to thank the people of this region. I also want to thank this. I'm very thankful for the invitation to speak at this Congress. I noticed that this is the Socialist Research Institute, if I translated it correctly. And I think this is really important to not have just, academic research institutes. And also the idea that, as Antonio Gramsci said, everyone is an intellectual. Everyone is a researcher. We're not Hegel, all of us. We're not Lenin, all of us, but we're all researchers. And I hope everyone in the room considers themselves a researcher in Marxism, because it's very important. And Lenin tells us this, because as early as 1902, he writes, "Without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement." This is a distinctive characteristic of all serious Marxism, and it's one of the differences between Marxism and anarchism. Okay. One place where Lenin stands out as a singular figure, whether compared to the classical revolutionary Marxists Leon Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg, or even Friedrich Engels, let alone less revolutionary ones like Karl Kautsky, is in his deep engagement with and incorporation into his overall theorizing of Hegel and dialectics. As I argued 30 years ago in my book, Lenin, Hegel, and Western Marxism, Lenin's Hegel notebooks of 1914 to 15 and the related essays and fragments on dialectics constituted the philosophical foundation for his post-1914 theoretical work, helping to shape that work into a body of creative revolutionary theory and practice. What drove Lenin to Hegel? Because he wasn't the type of guy that, well, it's the summer, I like just, read some novels, read some philosophical work. Almost everything Lenin wrote or researched was directly related to the project of revolution and anti-capitalism. Well, obviously, as we know, there was the First World War and there was the great betrayal of the socialists, many of the socialist parties which voted for the war. And then there were others who were like half against, half for the war. And I think this is very relevant to us today because we have a horrible genocidal war happening right now in the Gaza Strip and more broadly, and threatening now to spread to a wider war. And all of these, at least in the United States, all these progressive people, we have in the law school at Berkeley, University of California, there's a dean he was progressive, and they were saying when he was appointed, he's dangerous. He's going to make it too left wing. Well, this guy is like, I am 100% with Israel. He just, there was this whole article about it where a student was protesting and they pushed her basically out of his house. So this, or even the Social Democrats, even the left-wing Social Democrats, someone like Bernie Sanders couldn't come out clearly even for a ceasefire, let alone supporting the Palestinian side. So we have a similarity here in that, or at least this is one of the, I think there's a kind of a crisis of left-wing thought because over the past maybe 10 years, whether it's with Podemos or the Bernie Sanders movement or the Corbyn in the UK, these left-wing social democratic movements have arisen, but they have not met the moment of the Gaza war. And of course, the other thing is that what World War I brought about is it kind of ended to a lot of people the idea that capitalism was progressive in some generalized way. A lot even of the left-wing thinkers believe that. And the war, with its great destructiveness, kind of So the war and what Lenin faced there was a questioning of whether not simply capitalism as exploitation, but capitalism is actually destroying human life on the planet if it would go fully to its conclusion. Of course, the situation is different because in World War I, there were two sides. Each side was imperialist and exploitative. Here, we cannot, with the Palestine war, or frankly, the Ukraine war, it's not a question of both sidism. We have powers that want to just destroy the very existence of two nations, Palestine and Ukraine. So it's not an exact same situation, but I think this type of crisis that we're undergoing now is a similar one in some ways to what drove Lenin to study Hegel and should drive us to study the dialectic. Okay, so going straight into Lenin on the dialectic and on the science of logic, let me just say a few things in the first part of the presentation. The most compelling and famous statement in Lenin's Hegel notebooks is this: aphorism. It is impossible completely to understand Marx's Capital, and especially its first chapter, without having thoroughly studied and understood the whole of Hegel's logic. This has been widely quoted. In the US, it was even used in 1989. They made for the first time a paperback edition of Hegel's Science of Logic, and the publisher had as on the back cover this quote from Lenin. This quote has sent generations of Marxists to Hegel's book, despite the efforts of more orthodox materialists and anti-Hegelians to steer them away from such an endeavor. This was not an isolated statement on Lenin's part about the need, to study Hegel, nor was it completely restricted to his private notebooks, because at the end of his life, 8 years later, he wrote a programmatic article, one of his very last publications, 1922, and there he called on Marxists of the new Soviet Russia and their international comrades to carry out a systematic study of Hegelian dialectics from a materialist standpoint and to consider themselves a society of materialist friends of the Hegelian dialectic. And while it's not often mentioned, this is actually what George Lukács quotes a few months later in the preface to the first edition of History and Class Consciousness, written at a time when we knew that part of Lenin, but not the full philosophical notebooks. And the same year, Karl Korsch, who, like Lukács, was attacked for supposedly idealism by the Comintern in 1924, he also uses the same quote about materialist friends of the Hegelian dialectic at the beginning of his famous book, Marxism and Philosophy, also 1923. So anyway, but by the time Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the French existentialist, created the term Western Marxism versus ultra-Bolshevism, making this division, this is 1955, the link between Lenin and the very kind of Marxism Merleau-Ponty was extolling as an alternative to Leninism had been almost forgotten, because these critical, more Hegelian trends in Marxism also, many kinds of Marxism perhaps originate in Lenin. Maybe people claim Lenin, but this kind of Marxism, you can see it through Lukács, Korsch, through Marcuse, and some parts of the Frankfurt School. Henri Lefebvre, they all knew about Lenin and Hegel, but this gets forgotten. And so what has happened is the conspiracy of silence was on both sides. Soviet Stalinist Marx, later what became Stalinist Marxism and its offshoots, and the more independent Marxists in Western Europe, Japan, and North America. Those who tried to center Lenin's notes on Hegel were utterly marginalized. Now, George Lukács got into trouble with the party apparatus, not so much for extolling Hegel in general, dialectics in general, attacking positivism. They probably didn't like that. But what he did, but his real crime was to directly attack Engels himself for mechanical materialism and being similar to positivism. But here too, there's a link to Lenin. Lenin also attacks the people he calls vulgar materialists, not in the 1922 published article, but in several places in the 1914-15 philosophical notebooks. And he slightly even criticizes Engels as having limitations on the dialectic, but these parts never get published. So let me quote Lenin's statement again about the need to study Hegel's logic, but let me quote it, the full version. Okay. Aphorism, it is impossible completely to understand Marx's Capital, and especially its first chapter, without having thoroughly studied and understood the whole of Hegel's logic. Okay, I quoted that before. Then, consequently, none of the Marxists for the past half century have understood Marx. He's writing this in 1914. Now, just before that, in the notebooks, there's another statement where he talks about what he means by vulgar or crude materialism. The German term would be rohe Materialismus. And here he's attacking Georgy Plekhanov, the most famous Russian Marxist philosopher, who was Lenin's teacher and mentor in philosophy until 1914. But here's what Lenin writes in 1914, but attacking Plekhanov. Plekhanov criticizes Kantianism more from a vulgar materialist standpoint than from a dialectical materialistic one. A bit later, Lenin writes that Plekhanov wrote nothing about the large logic and Hegel's large logic in connection with its thought, dialectics proper as philosophical science. So Lenin was a philosophical follower of Plekhanov. You can certainly see this in his 1908 work, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. Didn't follow him organizationally since about 1902 or 3, but in philosophical matters, yes. So this is the big change in 1914. So we need to consider very carefully the meaning of Lenin's sentence stating that, not having made the thorough study of Hegel's science of logic that he was recommending now in his notes, this sentence, consequently, none of the Marxists for the past half century have understood Marx. Following here in the trajectory of my mentor, Raya Dunayevskaya, who began to work this out during her comradeship with C.L.R. James and Grace Lee Boggs in the 1940s, I conclude that Lenin surely meant to include himself, make a self-critique, include himself among those Marxists who had not understood Marx because he had not made the requisite study of Hegel's science of logic. Having said that, it follows that the 1914-15 Hegel notebooks constitute a sharp philosophical break in Lenin's thought, a break with his own crude materialist past. Second, in these notebooks, Lenin credits idealism in new ways, suggesting that the ideal and the real stand in relationship to each other in dialectical thinking. Lenin holds that human consciousness can go beyond the given reality in a positive revolutionary manner, most strikingly in his exclamatory statement, man's or human consciousness not only reflects the world, but creates it. So yes, we're materialists. Consciousness reflects the world, but not only that. Revolutionary consciousness seeks to go beyond the existing conditions. And Lenin makes exactly this connection to the social world of change and revolution. The world does not satisfy man, and man decides to change it by his activity. This comment did not come out of thin air, nor was it merely a general response to Hegel. Rather, Lenin seemed to be responding specifically here to Hegel's statement of the practical idea, treatment of the practical idea, where to surprise of a lot of people, in Hegel himself, the human subject quest to change the world, and as Hegel wrote, the subject possesses a certainty of its own actuality in the non-actuality of the world. It is important to note that these remarks by Lenin, interesting in themselves, concerned an equally interesting section of the science of logic, where to the surprise of many, including Lenin, Hegel seems to rate the practical idea higher than the theoretical idea. I'm almost quoting him when I say that the practical idea is higher than the theoretical idea. Writing that as the concept moves between the theoretical and the practical idea, their conflict did not begin to resolve until cognition is restored and united with the practical idea. This part of Hegel's science of logic and Lenin's response to it preoccupied people like Lukács, Raya-Dunayevskaya, and others, but in very different ways. To be sure, this is because it can be connected to the Marxian notion of the unity of theory and practice, point amplified by the fact that Hegel begins the next and final chapter of the science of logic by saying the absolute idea is not God, it's the unity of theory, the theoretical, and the practical idea. That's the first sentence of the absolute idea chapter. Third, Lenin found further social and material content in Hegel's work, especially where he least expected to in this absolute idea chapter, where he exclaims that Lenin stretches a hand to materialism. It is significant that Lenin did so in reading the Science of Logic, a Hegel text that lacks much social or historical content, in contrast to the one that most radical intellectuals and even revolutionaries read today, which is the phenomenology of spirit. Lenin's reading of the absolute as partly materialist also constitutes a point of difference with Engels, because Engels, in his famous essay of 1886, stressed the revolutionary character of Hegel's dialectic method versus his philosophical system, culminating in the absolute with the absolute pilloried as a dogmatic flight into a pure idealism of no use to Marxists. A few more specifics. First, Lenin takes down the following passage from Hegel's Science of Logic. This is from the earlier parts. The ideality of being for itself as totality thus passes over in the first place to reality, and this too in its most fixed abstract form as the one. And Lenin makes the following comment on this passage. The idea of the transformation of the ideal into the real is profound, very important for history, but also in the personal life of man, as it is evident that there is much truth in this, against vulgar materialism. The difference of the ideal and the material is not unconditional, not boundless. While the above remark by Lenin is hardly a thorough exposition of Hegel's category of being for self, it is a key statement of what he is developing for himself out of his reading of Hegel. At another point, in the famous section on contradiction, probably to Marxists the most famous section of Hegel's logic, Lenin now makes Hegel's law of contradiction and Hegel's law of self-movement, Selbstbewegung, or more generally his dialectic, not only the key to an understanding of Hegel, but also of Marxism. First, Lenin writes down in his notes 5 full paragraphs from Hegel's brief section on the law of contradiction. The key has become self-movement and not merely movement. This self-movement arises from within the subject matter. It is not a steady flow or the product of an external force, but of the inner contradictions of the subject matter that constitute the heart of dialectical development and change. Transforming this into a statement in terms of social theory, we could say that the internal contradictions of a given society are the key to grasping changes within that society, changes which develop as a process of self-development and self-movement by self-conscious human subjects, normally collective human subjects. Obviously, one is to add here that for a Marxist like Lenin, these are in fact more those collective subjects, like the working class, the peasantry, or oppressed nationalities, or ethno-racial groups. Lenin, becomes very enthusiastic over having first discovered this not in Marx but directly in Hegel. Movement and self-movement, spontaneous, internally necessary movement, change, movement in life, the principle of every self-movement, drive or impulse, trieb, to movement and activity, the opposite of dead being. Who would believe this at the core of Hegelianism, of abstract and abstruse, difficult, absurd Hegelianism? Thus, movement and self-movement have their basis in the internal contradictions of things and social phenomena. In viewing this movement as at the same time spontaneous and internally necessary, Lenin is rejecting the crudely deterministic models of the Marxism of the Second International, while at the same time identifying with Hegel's notion of an historically and socially grounded constitutive subjectivity. This constitutive self-movement through contradiction, not identity or dead being, is for Lenin the core of Hegel's science of logic, something he is evidently surprised to discover. Later in the book of the Science of Logic, on the notion or concept, that's the last several hundred pages of the book, Lenin makes his most decisive break with crude materialism and determinism as he enters that work's penultimate chapter. As mentioned before, but worth repeating, given its importance, in his notes on the idea of cognition, Lenin continues a procedure he developed in earlier sections of his notebooks. He places long quotes from Hegel on the left side of the page and his own translation into Marxist terms on the right-hand side. And it's his own statement at this point is one of the most far-reaching. I quoted it before. Man's cognition not only reflects the objective world, but creates it. And that could be, Lenin has traveled a very long distance from the crude reflection theory of materialism and imperial criticism. If, as here, cognition creates rather than merely reflect, cognition does reflect the world, but not only reflects the world. By cognition here, he most certainly means not only philosophical or scientific cognition as developed by Hegel, but also the type of cognition embodied in revolutionary theory, since that is, after all, his focus, his aim in reading Hegel. To be sure, this cognition reflects and describes the world which to Lenin would mean the material and historical world. In addition, however, as Lenin now holds, cognition creates the world. In many respects, this aphorism is the high point of the entire Hegel notebooks in terms of Lenin's rethinking and reorganization of his philosophical categories. Okay, part 2, the dialectics of imperialism and national liberation. Besides his writings on Hegel and the dialectic proper, a second core aspect of Lenin's thought that has important resonance today is his new dialectical theory of imperialism and the whole era of monopoly capitalism, a stage of capitalism that persisted in, well, some say until today, I would say until 1929 with the crash, when it was replaced by state capitalism, I would say the stage we still inhabit. Anyway, in Lenin's time, be that as it may, in Lenin's time, imperialism and monopoly constituted a new and more hegemonic form of capitalism with greater global reach, but the second stage of capitalism, which followed its first competitive phase, also evidenced new contradictions that pointed toward resistance, instability, and revolution. These theoretical notions that can be demonstrated, particularly in Lenin's 1916 article on the Easter Uprising in Ireland, the Great National Uprising, owed something to the Hegel notebooks. These new contradictions inside monopoly capitalism and the imperialism and the imperialist war that flowed out of this stage of capitalism manifested themselves especially in the flowering of national liberation movements. These were often located in predominantly agrarian societies rooted in the peasantries of Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Lenin argued that Marxists had to support these movements unreservedly and forcefully so long as they had a liberatory content, even if not explicitly a socialist one. Moreover, he held that national liberation movements could, under certain circumstances, step off ahead of the working classes in the fight for global revolution against capital. Still, of course, the working class movement remained decisive. In a related context, Lenin also theorized the relationship of the working classes to oppressed national and racial minorities within large nations, arguing for their cultural and linguistic autonomy, or if ultimately desired the right to secede and form a separate nation state. To be sure, Lenin's formulations on ethnicity and nation had serious limitations in practice, since in Soviet Russia these policies were often canceled out by a centralized one-party state that was starting to form while Lenin was still alive. However, enough remained of this legacy, at least as an intellectual heritage, for as Susie mentioned, Vladimir Putin declared, I'm quoting from 2016, that Lenin had left behind a time bomb sitting under the Russian state due to a nationalities policy based on total equality, along with the right of each to secede. That this was a time bomb, this was dangerous. And in this way, Putin blamed Lenin for helping to endanger the collapse of the Soviet Union and for Ukraine's effort to break away from the Russian sphere of domination. Be that as it may, in terms of events inside Russia, the most important thing, I think, is the impact of Lenin's concept of national liberation on a global level, both in his own time and the decades that followed. Thus, in the years after 1917, Lenin's theory of imperialism and national liberation and the practices of the early USSR at junctures like the 1920 Baku Conference of the Peoples of the East helped to make Marxism into a truly international movement of both ideas and action, allowing it to deeply penetrate the global South for the first time. In this regard, let us quote again, but more fully, from Lenin's programmatic 1922 article on dialectics, the one Lukács quoted, and I quoted, on the need for Marxists to become materialist friends of the Hegelian dialectic. The longer version of the quote will show the complex framework in which Lenin's call for the study of Hegel and dialectics was embedded, a framework in which anti-colonial national liberation movements were intertwined with Hegel and dialectics. This is not my intertwining. This is Lenin's intertwining. So here's the longer quote from this 1922 article. In order to attain this aim, the contributors to Under the Banner of Marxism must arrange for the systematic study of Hegelian dialectics from a materialist standpoint, i.e. the dialectics which Marx applied practically in his Capital and in his historical and political works, and applied so successfully that now every day of the awakening to life and struggle of new classes in the East, Japan, India, China, i.e. the hundreds of millions of human beings who form the greater part of the world population, every day of awakening to life of new peoples and new classes serves as a fresh confirmation of Marxism. Of course, this study, this interpretation, this propaganda of Hegelian dialectics is extremely difficult, and the first experiments in this direction will undoubtedly be accompanied by errors. But only he who never does anything never makes mistakes. Taking as our basis Marx's method of applying materialistically conceived Hegelian dialectics, we can and should elaborate this dialectics from all aspects, print in the journal abstract from Lenin Hegel's principal works, interpret them materialistically, and comment upon them with the help of examples of the way Marx applied dialectics, as well as examples of dialectics in the sphere of economic and political relations, which recent history, especially modern imperialist war and revolution, provides an unusual abundance. In my opinion, the editors and contributors of, Under the Banner of Marxism is the English title of the journal, should be a kind of a society of materialist friends of the Hegelian dialectic. When this passage is read in full, as I just did, we can now contrast Lenin not only to the crude materialists who rejected Hegel, some of whom all the way to today, but also to those Eurocentric Marxists who failed to see that the revolutions outside Europe would be the motor of 20th and 21st century revolution. Here, Lukács and Korsch do not look so good as they did at the beginning of my presentation, as they isolated what Lenin joined together, dialectics in Hegel and philosophy, and dialectics of revolution in a very concrete form, imperialism and national liberation. For they did not mention Lenin's discussion of revolution in Asia. They truncated, they just took, these quotes that are in a little bit of isolation. Now, without Lenin did not know what they had written, but he did know about the Marxism of the Second International. And so we can see this same element in his last theoretical essay, the so-called Notes on Sukhanov, written in January 1923 and published a few months later after he'd gone completely into the coma that eventually killed him. So this is Lenin's last theoretical text. They all call themselves Marxists, but their conception of Marxism is impossibly pedantic. They've completely failed to understand what is decisive in Marxism, namely its revolutionary dialectics. They have even absolutely failed to understand Marx's plain statements that in times of revolution, the utmost flexibility is demanded. Up to now, they have seen capitalism and bourgeois democracy in Western Europe follow a definite path of development and cannot conceive that this path can be taken as a model only mutatis mutandis, only with certain amendments, quite insignificant from the standpoint of the general development of world history. For instance, it has not even occurred to them that because Russia stands on the borderline, she could and was indeed bound to reveal certain distinguishing features, although these, of course, are in keeping with the general line of world development. They distinguish the Russian Revolution from those which took place in the West European countries and introduce certain partial innovations as the revolution moves on to the countries of the East. Our Sukhanovs, and Sukhanov he's saying is like a little better, our Sukhanovs, not to mention social democrats still further to the right, never even dream that revolutions cannot be made any other way. Our European Philistines never even dream that the subsequent revolutions in Oriental countries which possess much vaster populations and a much vaster diversity of social conditions will undoubtedly display even greater distinctions than the Russian Revolution. Again, the relationship of dialectics to really grasping imperialism, national liberation, and the concrete analysis and practicing of revolution could not be put more strongly. What a tragedy that the strain of Marxism interested the most in dialectics. Lukács, the Frankfurt School, Henri Lefebvre, etc., gave little attention to imperialism, revolution, national liberation, or race. There are, of course, exceptions. The semi-Marxist Franz Fanon and the school of Marxism that educated me, Raya Dunayevskaya and her erstwhile comrade C.L.R. James, but of course, I guess that's why I ended up here and I wrote that book. So, concluding remarks, on the early discussion of Lenin's Hegel notebooks in the United States, because this is where this separation, there was not this separation. So with your indulgence, I'd like to conclude with a little bit about my own intellectual influences, those that launched me as a writer on Lenin and Hegel and dialectics. I would like to do so by outlining briefly the little-known origins of the discussion of Lenin's Hegel notebooks in the United States in the 1940s by the first Marxist group that placed these notebooks at the very center of their theory and practice. I refer to the creative development of Marxism in the United States after and during the Second World War by the Johnson-Forrest tendency, 1941 to 1955. This small but intellectually active faction of the Trotskyism at that time was led by C.L.R. James, who called himself Johnson, and Raya Dunayevskaya, who called herself Forrest, and Grace Lee Boggs, because as someone said a few years later, America is a semi-authoritarian society, so you never really had the freedom openly to be a Marxist in the United States, which you still don't in a certain sense. Eager to extend their state capitalist analysis of Stalin's Russia and to theorize the relationship of race and class in the United States versus the reigning class reductionism, they also began to separate themselves from the Leninist concept of the vanguard party, but at the same time exploring the young Marx of 1844 and Lenin's Hegel notebooks. Dunayevskaya translated them in the 1940s, but could never find a publisher. This was the first time that a group of Marxist thinkers had made Lenin's Hegel notebooks their main philosophical point of departure. During this period, C.L.R. James published in mimeograph form, what's now a somewhat famous book, Notes on Dialectics, Hegel, Marx, Lenin, that's 1948. This stressed issues in Lenin like breaks and leaps rather than revolutionary gradualness, spontaneity versus top-down revolutionary movements, and self-movement by conscious human subjects. It was not entirely surprising that in approaching Hegel in dialectics, James, an Afro-Caribbean, Dostoevsky, a Russian-American, and Lee, a Chinese-American, drew their dialectical inspiration more from Lenin, a thinker originating in the borderland between Europe and Asia, rather than Central European Hegelians like Marcuse, who they did study. Of course, they were also Trotskyists, and thus Leninists in politics, but none of the other leading Trotskyists of the time, or Trotsky himself, had much interest in dialectics, let alone Hegel. More orthodox Trotskyists tended toward mechanical materialism. Most of the intellectuals drawn to Trotskyism in the United States laced their Marxism with a dose of John Dewey's anti-Hegelian philosophy of pragmatism, which can be seen in the writings of the anti-Hegelian academic Marxist philosopher Sidney Hook, very famous then, but now mercifully almost forgotten. In those days, Herbert Marcuse's Reason and Revolution, which was attacked viciously by these neo-pragmatists, who tried to say, well, Hegel is really more fascist than liberatory. Herbert Marcuse's Reason and Revolution offered a dialectical Hegelian alternative to such anti-Hegel perspectives. In dozens of unpublished letters in 1949 to 51, these three philosophers of the Johnson Forest tendency, Dostoevsky, C.L.R. James, and Grace Lee Boggs, took up subjectivity, the idealist element in dialectics, attacking mechanical materialism with their bête noire as Nikolai Bukharin, author of this thing, historical materialism, where he says, he actually says that I am a mechanical materialist. He's their kind of prime enemy. Their discussions saw philosophy as linked to Marxist politics and economics. Thus, a point they took up while theorizing about Lenin, not found in Lukács or Marcuse, was the notion, as I was trying to develop today, that Lenin's books like Imperialism, The Highest Stage of Capitalism, or The State and Revolution were grounded in dialectics and his study of Hegel. The first published discussion in English of Lenin and Hegel came after the breakup of the Johnson Forest tendency. With my mentor Dostoevsky's book, Marxism and Freedom, it included analysis of the Hegel notebooks as a nodal point in dialectical thought, and also their first translation into English in the appendix. In a chapter on Lenin and Hegel relating to the betrayal of revolutionary Marxism by the Second International at the outbreak of the war in 1914, Dostoevsky took up how Lenin's first theoretical response was to re-examine his philosophical foundations with a deep study of Hegel's science of logic. She extolled his new dialectical insights into issues like self-movement, the revolutionary character of dialectical idealism, and the cul-de-sac of vulgar materialism, with the latter including Lenin's own earlier writings like Materialism and Empirical-Criticism. In interpreting anew Lenin's theory of imperialism, she saw his concepts of the aristocracy of labor and his national liberation as outgrowths of his labor studies, with particular focus on his writings on the 1916 Easter Uprising in Ireland. She also viewed the state and revolution as a product of Hegelian Marxian insights. And I want to add that in 1978-79, as a young doctoral student about to become a PhD candidate, I had in mind a dissertation on Georges Lukács, Jean-Paul Sartre, Herbert Marcuse. But then Dostoevsky made the suggestion, why don't you write, no one is writing on this thing of Lenin and Hegel. Why not Lenin and Hegel instead of Lukács, Sartre, and Hegel? My professors at the university, this guy George Uri Fisher was a great academic Marxist, semi-anarchist, he says, okay, I will support you, but let's go for a walk. We walked around for 1 hour, and he said, if you do this, you realize you're committing like suicide as far as academic job markets. And I said, yeah, I knew that. I never wanted to become a bourgeois. I would never be sitting here I wanted to be a revolutionary. So that's how I ended up writing it. Okay, in summing up, in response to The Crisis of Marxism in 1914, Lenin explored the foundations of a socialism gone wrong and decided to go back to its philosophical and dialectical foundations by studying the Hegel science of logic. We've had more of like a slow crisis of the past maybe 10 years, although kind of coming to a head with the Gaza war. Two, this led to a new dialectical theory of national liberation rooted in both social reality and a new dialectical vision. And of course, not limited to that, also like important remarks that were taken up about Blacks in America and other ethnic minorities in countries that's the Irish, obviously very explicit. All this is terribly important, not just for history, but I think for today. Lenin anticipates, I know not everyone likes this word, but I actually use the word now, intersectional Marxism. Lenin is an intersectional Marxist avant lettres, but there's intersectionality and there's intersectional Marxism. The other intersectionals don't always want to include it. An intersectional Marxism that includes the working class, but also oppressed national minorities, women, LB, lesbian, bisexual, gay, transgender, queer, LGBTQ people, and the fight versus imperialism and environmental destruction. I would say, of course, I wouldn't be here if I didn't think that Lenin not only anticipates what we're doing, but his theory and his practice help to clarify our theory and our practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So yeah,
Can you listen to me? I hope so.
Well, you have mentioned a couple of the categories that Lenin employs in his notebooks, such as self-movement, contradiction, practical idea. I would like you to deepen into the explanation of what is peculiar to Hegel's philosophy that is so useful or productive to Marxism, not only in relation to the most abstract categories of Marxist capital. As Lenin says in his aphorism, no one can understand capital without understanding Hegel's science of logic, but especially in relation to the revolutionary practice and its strategic and tactical or tactic political concretion. What is then the relation, if any, between the abstract thought categories or determinations of Hegel's science of logic and revolutionary politics?
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, well, let's start with the Communist Manifesto. All hitherto existing history is the history of the class struggle. And I once had a professor who said, well, this shows how stupid Marx was, because is the class struggle happening right now in America? Is it in New York City right now? But of course, he didn't read the whole thing, which is that sometimes hidden, sometimes open. So these deep as Lukács said in his great and underestimated book, in my opinion, The Young Hegel, 1948, the contradictory character of reality. This is what Hegel really brought out. So when you look at the world, I look at a society like China. Yes, comrade Xi Jinping. Yes, everything good. I agree with you 100%. But then I see, at the party Congress, this guy starts to this old guy, former prime minister, they have to escort him out. I look at that, and it's at the same time that just a few hundred Chinese students are protesting here and there around the world. there's deep contradictions inside that most successful capitalist country that calls itself communist. There's deep contradictions there, and we have to search for that. But Hegel also tells us that you cannot jump to the absolute like a shot out of the pistol, that you have to go through the labor, patience, and suffering, the negative. He actually criticizes the French revolutionaries, and he's partly reacting against the brutality, violence of the revolution. As a good, bourgeois, but he also thinks they tried to jump too fast to the absolute. That's what he says. The phenomenology. So with Hegel, there's this famous or infamous statement that C.L.R. James and Ryadenievskaya loved, but sounds almost crazy to a lot of people. The fact is before it exists. Let me repeat that. The fact is before. This seems to violate empirical reality. So, but what Hegel is saying is that immanent or pregnant in the present is the future that is in the present. It's sitting there. It's in, like Susie was talking about the Soviets, and even Lenin, because they had Soviets in 1905, right? Big ones. But even Lenin, when he writes his article on his speech on the revolution, 1905 revolution, January 1917, just before, a few months before, first of all, he says, well, I will probably never live to see the revolution. So he didn't see what was coming, but it's hard to see what's coming. He also, it's like about 10, 15, 20 pages, one paragraph on the Soviets. He does acknowledge it, but almost forgotten. But the workers did not forget it, because whether they, had meetings and talked about it or not, but once the struggle emerged, it was like, let's do these Soviets. And of course, they become much more widespread. They spread more deeply into the military, the hardcore of the state. And so there's a working class consciousness that looks to go beyond the existing society. All Marxists say that, contradiction. I mean, who would say, no, I'm against the idea of contradiction? Even Bukharin would probably say, it's part of something there. Althusser, well, he tries to write about it, but he doesn't like dialectics for him. So to these ideas, and there's many more, but the notion that whenever you look at reality, you're going to see contradiction, but it doesn't mean that it's going to jump immediately to the full revolution. And secondly, that inside society, not just in the eye of the philosopher, but inside society is this yearning for new social relations, for communism, really. And that, of course, a philosophy like Hegel, he develops that, takes that to the conclusion in a way, in a very idealistic level. And just, I don't know, I just feel the more I read Hegel, the better I can analyze the world. And I know that Marx felt that, and we can, I think, see it in Lenin. I mean, the social scientists like to say correlation is not cause, but Lenin read Hegel, then he wrote Imperialism, then he wrote State and Revolution. Most people in this room would agree that State and Revolution and Imperialism are two really great books. Well, he read Hegel and dialectic before that. And so this is really the practical idea. Lenin bringing Hegel down into the practical world of revolution and politics.
Okay. You remark the singularity of Lenin's engagement with Hegel, that unlike other revolutionaries of his time, like Rosa Luxemburg or Leon Trotsky, he was the only one that systematically worked with Hegel's philosophy and so on. Besides this singularity, would you affirm that Lenin's interpretation of Hegel, or Lenin's particular reading of Hegel, opens any sort of original trend in the field of dialectical materialism. That is, there's something like Lenin's own conception of what dialectical materialism means, and thus does Lenin inaugurate any new line of research that is worth developing? That would be my second question.
Well, I think what I've been saying, trying to say, concepts are like self-movement, are concepts like human consciousness, not only reflecting but also creating the world. This is a kind of Marxism that is deeply indebted to Hegel. And yeah, as for, okay, what is Lenin's and Hegel interpretation? Above all, it is seeing Hegel as the quintessentially revolutionary philosopher. To see this, almost everything Hegel is writing, because you have to realize that Hegel is a product of the French Revolution. As a boy, 19 years old, he salutes the French Revolution. As a mature scholar, he writes the Phenomenology of Spirit, just as Napoleon's forces are entering Prussia, and he's actually very happy about that because he thinks changes are going to come. And then as an older man, they say, I mean, he was more conservative, but he operated under censorship, and he taught in very abstract terms. And books like The Philosophy of Right and The Philosophy of History are quite conservative works. And as Marxists, we have, and certainly Lenin criticized those works. But it's where Hegel, and I think this is something that starts with Lenin, but other people have said this since, it's where Hegel is the most abstract that he is the most revolutionary. He has this great thing about slavery and the master and the slave, where he's kind of talking about the Greco-Roman world. He doesn't talk about slavery of the Africans in his own time. He doesn't mention the Haitian Revolution. But maybe he's implicit. You know, Susan Buck Morris has a book, Hegel in Haiti, where she tries to suggest that the impact of the Haitian Revolution may have made Hegel. So maybe that was also just self-censorship. We can never know with Hegel, because almost all the letters were destroyed. He's living all his life under authoritarian regimes. But certainly the young people and students thought of him as revolutionary. And when he died too young in 1831, I mean, the students of Berlin, they marched on the street, tens of thousands with torches, and it was the democratic element among the students. And then afterwards, the regime forbade all public funerals like that for a while. So I would say the biggest point is that Lenin, Hegel as a philosopher of revolution, I would say that that's what he gave us. That's the most important thing. It's philosopher of revolution, not practitioner of revolution, philosopher of revolution.
It's been almost 30 years since the publication of your book, Lenin, Hegel, and Western Marxism. Since then, the research both on Hegel's and Lenin's life and work has developed greatly. But what about the research on the relation between Lenin and Hegel? Could you be able to indicate any substantive innovation or original claim in this field that has occurred since the publication of your book? And in this sense, do you think that there's still a work to be done in Lenin and Hegel studies, to put it somehow?
Yeah, I think this can be seen in the book Lenin Reloaded, which I know is published in Spanish, I think fairly recently, the Zizek edited, because that was about 20 years ago, but it was published a little later. And there's several articles, chapters in there on Lenin and Hegel. Stathis Kouvelakis is the one that deals with it the most extensively. And then Thomas Krauss has a book on Lenin that deals with Hegel. There are some newer scholars like Lyndon Porter, a young African-American guy who studied with me. He's starting to write essays on Lenin and Hegel and imperialism, and it was said that Lenin never wrote on Africa, but he's going to present this at the Historical Materialism Conference in New York. It's his first presentation, and he figured out that no, actually Lenin wrote about the 1884 Congress where Africa was partitioned. So this is about Africa. So he did consider that. I mean, maybe not as much as we would like to, but it's not like he only wrote about, because you could see in what I quoted, he's talking about Asia. He most often talks about Asia. So yeah, there's been some work, but I think more importantly, I think it's almost impossible to write about Lenin's thought is nowadays without acknowledging this thing. Whereas when I first wrote my book, there were two encyclopedias. One was the Encyclopedia of Political Thought. The other was the Dictionary of Marxism, edited by, I don't remember who edited those two, but Thomas Baltimore edited. They both had entries on Lenin. They were like each maybe, 2,000 words. Neither of them mentioned the Hegel notebooks. They didn't even mention it. It's impossible now, I think, not to at least mention it. But there needs to be a lot more discussion of this. And I think one of the reasons why there wasn't more was because Lenin kind of died. In the height of neoliberalism, I mean, very few. I mean, when Zizek had that comments on Lenin, it wasn't like there were a lot of other discussions of Lenin going on. But in the I was just amazed. I had been surprised that this year, 2024, I personally have been invited to like 4 congresses on Lenin to speak. And I know there must be much more. Like there's going to be one in Barcelona in a couple months. There's this ongoing one, Leninist Days. There's this one. And I think, I can't remember, I think it's at least one more. And there'll probably be a lot others that I'm not aware of. So I think now that Lenin is being discussed again, and hopefully will not just, thank you, Lenin, for your anniversary, and then we'll go back to whatever we do. I hope it continues, and if it continues, I think there will be even more discussion of these issues.
Okay, the floor is now open for questions from the audience. Si alguien quiere hacer alguna pregunta, tiene ahora la oportunidad. No sé si hay algún micrófono para prestar o...
I don't know whether there are available microphones for you to use, but anyway, the floor is yours.
Hi, I'm another Alex. I'm one of the speakers here. I wanted to say that Kevin's great presentation, he's too polite to say it, but really it explodes the interpretation of Lenin as a loyal Kautskyite that Lars Lee presented in the previous session. And because Lenin is very explicit in the philosophical notebooks. There's one passage where he compares Plekhanov with the naturalistic materialism that was ideologically dominant in Germany in the 19th century. Now, one has to say that Plekhanov was considerably more philosophically sophisticated than Kautsky. So if he's rubbishing his own mentor as a naturalistic materialist, then it applies even more strongly against Kautsky. Now, there are many things to say about what's going on here, and I think, Kevin, as I said, has given a great talk, but the the question of how Marxists appropriate Hegel is considerably more complicated than, for example, what James does, which is to quote various passages from Hegel and then to point to their contemporary relevance or something like that. But I think, to go back to Lenin, I think part of what is going on here is that Lenin's actual practice as a revolutionary Marxist in Russia, even if he thought he was being a good Kautskyite, was considerably more innovative. So Jody talked about one key text of Lenin's, which is the agrarian program of Russian social democracy in the revolution, I think in 1907. And it's a very, very interesting text because, as Jody said, Lenin says, not there's, you know, an inevitable single course of historical development in Russia. We look at the agrarian question, there are two possibilities. There's a kind of bourgeois revolution from above, in which the landowners convert themselves into capitalists and reinforce the existing Tsarist authoritarian regime, or there's a revolution from below that is driven by the peasantry themselves in alliance with the working class. So history doesn't follow a predetermined path. There are alternative possibilities. Now, I think Kautsky hedges his bets a bit, but I think that's very difficult to fit into the kind of Kautskyan conception of history as a naturalistic process. So I think what happens in 1914 is that a light bulb shines above Lenin's head and he says, oh, well, Kautsky wasn't so good after all. And he starts to rethink his understanding of Marxism, and he uses Hegel for that. So therefore, I think what Kevin has been talking about and what he develops much more fully not in his books, is very important to understanding the distinctive contribution that Lenin makes to Marxism.
Que conteste o habla ahora.
To answer him now? No, it's a good comment. I agree.
He agrees. So,
Como quiera.
You like it? Okay, the same. Thank you so much for your magnificent presentation. And so I do absolutely agree with the fact that Hegel is the philosopher of the revolution, but I would say rather of the ideal possibility of the revolution and its reality, because as we all know, the young Hegel is really very passionate about the French Revolution, but the old Hegel is very afraid of it, and he becomes a counter-revolutionary, or at least a defender of the reforms in the Prussia of its time, his time. So my question is a little bit strange, but since Lenin, given that Lenin plays the main role in the Russian Revolution, my question would be, let's imagine, could we imagine that Lenin, the last Lenin, after this experience of the revolution between 1916 and 1923, or at the moment of his death, perhaps would have reviewed, would have rechecked, revised his reading, which was a little bit idealistic of Hegel, or maybe the other way around. Maybe he had prolonged his reading in order to analyze the contradiction of these first years of construction of socialism, let's call it like this. So I know it's a question which is a speculation by itself, but I would like, if you have got, I would like to know whether you have got any answers to this. Would Lenin had rechecked his reading of Hegel from the previous years, the years prior to the revolution, after the experience of the revolution? Not, of course, that he would have experienced the same as Hegel, because in this case he would have become a counter-revolutionary, but which would have been the line if there had to be any line at all?
Yeah, thank you for both of those comments. As far as Alex, as I said, I agree. But let me just say, yeah, I think this is a really important point. This kind of naturalism. People tried to make too much of Marx's support for Darwin, and I think Engels actually gives us a little bit of throws a curve there. At Marx's funeral, he says, above all, Marx was a revolutionist. Okay, that part is great. But then he says, as Darwin developed the thing, Marx developed the theory of value and surplus value. So that left open. I mean, Engels himself didn't do that, but it left open for later people to go to this, naturalism. Like they used to teach Charles Darwin at the New York Socialist School in the early 20th century. And probably that's that kind of anti-clericalism of the left, that has some problems in other ways. Yeah, so and Lenin versus Kautsky, I mean, obviously, if Lenin spent 20 years as a Kautskin, it's not going to wash away. It will never wash away completely, obviously. But that takes us, but there's a real effort because it's such a horrific juncture. I mean, we don't remember World War I as much as we should because we've had so many other barbaric and even more barbaric wars since then. But at the time, I mean, it killed 10 million people, and that's not even counting Asia. So this was just such a break for all of Western culture. Okay, what would Lenin have done? Obviously, we don't know. We do know from that thing I read that he really thought that the Marxists should make direct studies of Hegel's dialectic, and this should somehow be linked to the conceptualization about imperialism and the revolution moving eastward. At the time he's writing that, the revolutions have been defeated to an extent in Western Europe, Central and Western Europe, but China is popping, and other places are having a lot of unrest. What he would have done with that, I mean, we obviously, as you say, it's a speculative question. Lenin also at the end of his life, he says because privately, these attacks on Plekhanov are private. Publicly, he says you should read Plekhanov, and publicly he allows materialism and imperial criticism to be reprinted, and there's a so I'm not even sure Lenin himself, when Alex was hinting at this, Lenin himself was not fully aware of how far he traveled in such a short time. So all I'll say is, because a lot of people, I remember when I wanted to learn about Marxist dialectics, someone said, oh, go read History and Class Consciousness. Well, go read Lenin's philosophical notebooks. Make that your introduction to dialectics. First of all, Lenin is a really clear writer. And I think that's his legacy one part of his legacy, but his philosophical legacy, that is to have given us this, and this can really be an entry point into the dialectical mode of thinking. It's funny, neither Marx nor Lenin never said he was going to do it, but he writes this whole thing. You'd think that maybe if he writes all these hundreds of pages, he's going to eventually write at least an essay about Hegel and the dialectic, but he never does. Of course, he's pretty busy with stuff. And then Marx, as I think a lot of people in this room know, Marx says in 1858 that he intends to write an essay on the dialectic, but he never does that either. And the way he describes it, he said, just a few pages, but then you can find another thing where he says just a few pages, and that became like what we know as volumes 2 and 3 of Capital. So when Marx said a short thing, he can never believe it. So I would just say that it's a general kind of legacy that we have. I urge young revolutionaries interested in the dialectic to begin their studies with Lenin and Hegel. And yeah, let me just leave it there, because I really don't have an answer. I don't think he was taking back the statements, but some might say, well, they're idealistic. Would he take them back? I don't think so. And of course, you also have to know, oh yeah, very important. It was only because of who knows how long it would have taken the Second International. They were slowly publishing a few works by Marx, like Theories of Surplus Value, some of the letters. But, whether you like it or not, as a Western Marxist, it was the Bolsheviks who published 1844 manuscripts and the German ideology, and started the first real collected works of Marx. So Lenin did not know the 1844 manuscripts, the place where Marx makes his most extensive discussion of Hegel and dialectics. So I think that's interesting to think about too. Lukács did not either at the time he wrote History and Class Consciousness.
Okay. I'm Marcel van der Linden, also part of one of the panels. I wanted to say there is a letter from Lenin to Gorky, 1906 or 7 or so, where he talks about the debate he had with Bogdanov about imperial criticism. And he says there that he had an agreement with Bogdanov that they would not quarrel about philosophy because that was not important for class struggle. Apparently later he revised that point of view, and he says in that letter, he says, I only attacked Bogdanov now because I was irritated. But it was not a political consideration that he brought in. So I think that Lenin shifted back and forth in his attitude towards the relevance of philosophy. But this may be a subject for further study.
Want me to comment on that? Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, Lenin was a supremely political individual. So it was Bogdanov's, what Lenin considered to be ultra-leftist stance, because Lenin, people may not know that, I mean, Lenin wanted to later says, to smash the state, down with reformism. Lenin believed even in the very authoritarian limited well, it wasn't even a constitution in Russia, that they should take advantage of the elections and run people. Bogdanov was saying, no, it's bourgeois election, not even fully bourgeois democracy. So the philosophical attack in materialism and imperial criticism is to undermine him politically. And there is one mention of Lukács by Lenin. It's in infantile communism, left-wing communism and infantile disorder, but it's not for Lukács's philosophical works, some of which were in German by 1920. So conceivably Lenin could have read these, although I have no way of knowing if he did. But Lukács was part of that wing that said, don't work inside the reformist trade unions, don't ever work in even coalition with the social democrats and so on. So he was part of the political. So yeah, And there's this interpretation of, which I disagree with, but why not let people know about it? James White, this is a great scholar, but I think mistaken on this point. He points out that in Stalinist Russia, Lenin's philosophic notebooks are finally published in 1929. This is at the time when Bukharin is coming under attack. So Stalin himself says, well, Bukharin wasn't really dialectical, because there is that, I think there's some of that out there. So the dialectic can really be misused. A friend of mine, he's a well-known intellectual, Sam Farber. He once told me that he was in high school in Cuba in 1956, and the Hungarian Revolution breaks out. So the workers are on strike. They're forming workers' councils. Russia comes in and crushes it. So he's in the Young Communist, so he comes to his leader, and his leader says, because Farber wants to support this, and he probably, that was the point that he continues from for the rest of his life. So that the leader says, oh, no, well, wait a minute. You have to go below the surface. You have to look at it dialectically. There's a lot of contradictions in these workers' councils and blah, blah, blah. So the dialectic can really be misused. And of course, this is not new. The birth of the dialectic in the Western world is Socrates and Plato and those guys sitting around, those privileged guys sitting around. And there's other people that are very critical, that they want to critical and tear down things and so on. Who are they? The sophists. And what is the big difference between the sophists and the true dialecticians? Is going back that far, and Lenin's and Marx are not in disagreement on this. The sophists don't have anything positive. It's what Hegel called in the logic the simple negation, not the negation of the negation, which the negation of the negation carries the positive inside the negative. I wandered away from the question, but I hope that.
Bai, euskaraz egin daiteke galdera, itzuliko diozu? Bai. Gaurko mundu okzidentaleko ideologia progresista dela izan daiteke, eta badaolako ideia bat, badagoela historia dela progresismoaren historia azkenean, progreso baten historia badela. Eta bada autore bat, Kostas Papaioan deitzen dena, greziaga, eta berak analizatzen duelarik, ikertzen duelarik, pentsamendu progresista horren jatorria, Marxen eta teorian aurkitzen du, eta Marxen pentsamenduaren eta Leninen pentsamenduaren genealogia egiterakoan, Hegelen eta teoriarat heltzen da, gaur aztertzen dugun teoriarat, eta Hegelen teoriaren genealogia egiterakoan kristianismorat heltzen da. Eta beraz, nolazbait, gaurko gure pentsamendu progresista hori, numaiten, jatorri guzi hori baduela, erraiten digu Kostas Papaioanuk. Galdera zen, ea autore hori ezagutzen duzuenez, idatzi du liburu bat deitzen dena La Consecración de la Historia.
Errepiketu alduzu bere izena. Autore honen izena, nola zen?
Historiaren konsekrazioa edo, la Consecración de la Historia. Autorea da Kostas Papaioanu. Ea ezagutzen duzuenez, eta ze pentsatzen duzuen honi buruz.
He establishes the genealogy of the concept, and he wants to know if you know the author and the book, and what do you think about that and its relation to Hegel.
Should I address the idea of progress in Lenin?
Maybe. Okay.
I'm sorry, I can't address that author directly, but just on the general question of progress, and I mean, I was saying before, World War I kind of kills off the idea of progress to a great, this inevitable progress, whatever. But I don't think Lenin is the one who breaks with it as fully as Rosa Luxemburg. Her writings on the war, I think, go a little further in rejecting this idea of a progress. Michel Lowy, if you know that name, the French Marxist, brings this out very well in some essays. And I think, well, there's a lot of reasons why that's that is or is not the case. Nobody believes in the idea of progress anymore. Hardly anyone does, except maybe the Chinese dominant ideology and some of the young people there. But anyway, this is something we really need to look at, because I think we have other versions of dialectics that are problematic from the other side, like the great Theodor Adorno. If you notice, I didn't mention him. But, you know, yes, there's progress from the bow and arrow to the nuclear weapon. Yeah. So that's a retrogressionism. That's a type of retrogressionism, which is the opposite of this crude progressivism, but it doesn't really solve the problem either. So yeah, I'll just end. There's stuff I could say, but let's see what else people.
Hi. As Kevin knows, I'm sort of skeptical about this whole story of Lenin meeting Hegel for a variety of reasons, factual about what Lenin was doing in the fall of 1914, and further the claim that Kevin made about Lenin's national question being a reflection, an outgrowth of his encounter with Hegel. There's no direct connection, and there is a lot of connection with other things. However, I'm not going to get into the argument, but you'll probably gather from this whole discussion that you find a Lenin quote almost for everything. I'm going to have a Lenin quote here because Kevin referred to it, and but didn't read it, so I'm going to read it if I can do it in my things. It's he's mentioned that Lenin's attacks on Plekhanov were in private, but in public he continued to praise him. Now, that's a little stranger than you might think. Why does Lenin do this if he has really turned his back on Plekhanov? Well, I'm going to read you what he said in late 1920, I believe. That's what I got here. About this advice to new party members. So Kevin gave advice to young Marxists. This is what Lenin's saying to young Marxists. Let me add, in parentheses, for the benefit of young party members, that you cannot hope to become a real intelligent communist without making a study, and I mean study, of all of Plekhanov's philosophical writings, because nothing better has been written on Marxism anywhere in the world. So the story, this is very strong. And if Lenin really thought that Plekhanov was a danger to revolutionary action, he really thought that Plekhanov and vulgar materialism was responsible for the disaster of 1914, that was an extremely irresponsible thing for him to say. It's not just being polite or inert. It's something that we should all reprehend him for. But I take him at his word. He continued to think that Plekhanov was what he just said he was. So I don't know exactly how to fit that all in, but I do think that Kevin has minimized that contradiction.
Yeah, I'm actually going to agree with you partly because I decided when I wrote this talk that this was the anniversary year of celebrating Lenin, and I do have criticisms of Lenin, but I only hinted at them. But on some other issues like national rights of ethnic groups, But there's other things, and yeah, I mean, I also inherited from my mentor, Raya Danievskaya, the notion of an ambivalent philosophical legacy in Lenin, because on the one hand, we need to study Hegel directly, all this kind of thing, and make new concepts out of that. But on the other hand, we've got to read Plekhanov, and as Alex was pointing out, even in discussing Hegel, Plekhanov is the only Marxist. I mean, there may have been other minor ones, but of any like well-known Marxists, Plekhanov is the only one who looks at some of this stuff about geography and so on, almost like there's a geographical determinism sometimes in Hegel. You know, India has hot weather, therefore a certain thing. Plekhanov actually, he considers that, here's some materialist stuff in Hegel, but it really becomes no better than some of the stuff we get in Montesquieu. So, yeah, there is a problem there, but at the same time, what happened in 1891, not a big year in Marxist revolution, but it happened to be the 60th anniversary of Hegel's death. So it's, the academics, I assume, are holding congresses about that. The Germans love to have these anniversary things. So in the whole Second International, they had some pretty cultivated Marxists in Germany and Austria and France. The only guy who wanted, and they were all guys except Rosa Luxemburg, prominent ones, theorists, and she wasn't even prominent yet. The only one who wanted to write an article on Hegel's anniversary was Plekhanov. So simply to have been interested in Hegel, rather than to say, well, Marx already critiqued that, because the Second International people some of them were pre-Kantian mechanical materialists, and some of them were Kantians, but they really neo-Kantians, but they really didn't, and bad neo-Kantians. So that, I'll quote Lukács, that he said, well, he's lucky that he wasn't educated in philosophy by the Second International, but by the neo-Kantians, because at least there's a little room for not being simply theory as a reflection of reality. So, yeah, I mean, I partly agree that, I would certainly say that there's an ambivalent legacy in Lenin on some of these questions. One last thing. Lenin is a party leader. He has these people sitting around the room like Bukharin or Zinoviev. They had not made their study of Hegel. He has to carry them along. It isn't like Stalin's Russia where, Lenin said this, they'll all fall in line. So he can't go too far in terms of how he talks about this. And he didn't live to write it up, where he maybe would have cleared up some of these ambivalences.
Sorry, I think the last thing that Kevin said about Lenin's context is very important, because 1920, when he writes this thing about Plekhanov, is the time of what's called the trade union debate in the Bolshevik party. I don't want to go into the details because they're not important. One of Lenin's Lars frowns, but the relevant thing is one of Lenin's opponents in that debate is Bukharin. And Lenin says that the problem with Bukharin is that he's very clever, but he doesn't understand dialectics. So it's possible, one would have to look at the date of the texts and so on, that coming back to Plekhanov is partly to counteract the kind of mechanical approach of Bukharin, who was a brilliant Marxist and very influential and a very popular Bolshevik leader. Because I think it's right, Lenin is always operating both as a thinker, but also as a party leader. The other thing I'd say is, I mean, what Kevin said about the kind of intellectual environment in the Second International, I think the figure, I think it's true that Plekhanov was one of the more sophisticated, philosophically sophisticated of the Marxists of the Second International. I think more sophisticated than him was Labriola, the Italian Marxist philosopher, although he was keener, this is a deviation of mine actually, which I share with him, he was keener on Spinoza than Hegel, but we won't go into that. Hegel is more than enough to deal with. But it's interesting, in the text on the 60th anniversary of Hegel's death, that Plekhanov says one of the things I can't remember the exact words, one of the things we take from Hegel is the idea of an irresistible striving towards change. In other words, what Plekhanov deals with Hegel seriously in a way that Kautsky never does. Kautsky says somewhere that Darwin came first for him rather than Marx. He approached Marx through a Darwinian lens, and actually he was a very bad Darwinist, but that's another question as well. But what Plekhanov takes from Hegel is partly the deterministic understanding of Marxism, which I think Lenin, he never fully and coherently develops it, but which is an important aspect of Lenin's Marxism. I forgot to say, when I talked about the two paths of possible development of Russian agriculture, that Lenin says what will make the difference between these two paths is whether the Social Democrats support the struggle of the peasants for the land, which of course the Mensheviks didn't want to do. They didn't have the same position of supporting the peasantry as Lenin developed. So there, what, if you're being Hegelian, you'd call subjectivity, what the revolutionaries themselves do is part of the historical equation that Lenin is addressing, and that's very importantly distinctive to Lenin's Marxism. Okay.
This is very instructive, I hope, to all of you to see what we're debating here. In any event, I'll just say my own view that you're being evasive, that you're trying to talk away something that's there, saying ambivalent, saying, oh, well, he must have been lying because he didn't say what he really thought because he had some political goal in mind. So how about just trying to say that he continued to admire Plekhanov? He didn't have to say that. He didn't have to go out of his way to say it. Why not just live with that fact? That's what I'm saying. And then one more point. We go on forever. Lenin, I have a strong connection, as you may have guessed, between Lenin and Kautsky. Nothing to do with the philosophy. I don't know if Lenin read Kautsky on philosophy. It had to do with Kautsky's version of what was going on in the world. And Kautsky's version of what was going on in the world in the early 20th century was an era of war and revolution. That's Kautsky's phrase. It's in several of his writings. Lenin really appreciated those writings. He never repudiated them. And this is the fact that my view of Kautsky comes from Lenin. And sooner or later, people will just have to deal with these facts about Lenin's attitude toward these people. Okay, so thank
you. Let me refer to your contribution, Alex. I'm very grateful that you brought in our discussion the name Labriola. Oh. So I hope my voice together with this will carry. I'm very glad that Alex mentioned Labriola. Labriola is the last orthodox Marxian, as Karl Korsch noted. I think he's quite right. Labriola was the founder of Marxist philosophizing. The strange thing is that he was then actively forgotten. He died in 1904, and he was in a kind of a conflict in the Italian party. He was the Marxist who had fought for the formation of the Socialist Party of Italy, fought against the workers, not against the workers. It was not a fight. How do you say? They try to. It's not a fight where you kill the other, but the question was, these workers were not even first generation of industrial workers. These were still from the poor, from the country. They all had their weapons for, wie sagt man, die Jagd, for hunting. And they were wild. They were decided to make revolution now. And he said to them, comrades, if you do that for the army, this is a game to just. And he won them over. He won them over to patience, revolutionary patience, and to be part of the new party, being in the moment of being on it. So then he published very little because he was a passionate speaker. And by the way, this was a tragedy because he had kinds of something like cancer of fear of the possibility to speak. He died miserably on German soil in Rome, in the hospital of the German embassy. Yeah. And before that, he very often appealed to Kautsky to publish his own essays, his own analysis. The famous Saggi, the three are ready, the three famous texts of Labriola, which you should read, which Engels read the first one in the proof, the first half, and said, yes, you are Marxist. And he was nominated by Engels, etc., etc. Now, this is important as a link because Plekhanov took the idea of philosophizing in Marxism from Labriola, but he took only the license to say, yes, we must know that Marx and Engels said it's over with philosophy. And Labriola, in this debate with Engels, said, look, what you do, Engels, and what Marx does, this has an implicit philosophy which is different from what the institution and the ruling ideology says. It's a new philosophy. And he created this expression by chance in the third saggio, in the middle of the saggio, Saggio's essay. Saggio, essay, saggio in Italiano. In the third essay, all of a sudden, without direct preparation, he says, oh, this is the philosophy of praxis. Yeah? So this is here is the foundation for Gramsci later, a generation later. But the problem is, inherited was the philosophizing in Marxism. And it was without the philosophy of praxis. It was the philosophy, the dialectical materialism. Gramsci will later say, in the category historical materialism, the accent has to be put on historical, because materialism is bourgeois ideology, of the Enlightenment. This is man-machine and things like that, the matter. And this has nothing to do with Marx. But Plekhanov steals, so to speak, the license to call that philosophy, and leaves aside the main thing, and he becomes the teacher of Lenin. For me, this is a tragedy in history. And Labriola, by the way, was a provocation for the leaders of the Second International, because he all made them clear he was recognized by Engels. This is finally someone with whom I can debate, and the others were jealous, so to speak. Kautsky the first. Kautsky did block the publication of Labriola in German, and it was Kautsky's wife, Louise, to whom Labriola one and other time wrote, "Tell your husband that he has to translate these things in the Neue Zeit, the founding revista of Marxism, one can say." So this is, I'm very glad that you brought this in. And, but now back to the point where the debate here was how Plekhanov is appreciated by Lenin in 20, and in a text which is a text of education of the coming generation, the new impatience, like Labriola, with these workers with weapons at home, and to impede their self-killing by making revolution, it's not possible. So I think that when he, in his text on left radicalism, he's not an academic philosopher. He's a political animal, if anyone was. So he's a political philosopher. That is, even when he speaks philosophy, he makes also politics. That is, he has not to create more enemies in a certain situation. He has to have alliances also. It was said going back and going forth some time ago in this debate. Yes, this is a theory of you have to be able in all situations to go back and to go forth. That is, you have to be flexible. And he explains the method, but he follows also the method in this discourse. So it is possible that he needed not one more enemy in a certain situation. He makes politics when he says it. Yeah? So
thank you. We have only 10 more minutes to finish this, so it will be okay to give Kevin the opportunity to answer if he wants.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I told Alex I don't think we will go the full time, but there were so many comments from so many eminent scholars and just everyone. I can't answer all of it, obviously. I just want to answer Laura's. I mean, obviously being evasive is in the eyes of the beholder. I think I acknowledge, certainly in my book, I acknowledge very clearly that this is an ambivalence in Lenin. I see a problem with the fact that Lenin taught that way about Plekhanov at the end of his life. I think Alex is right about the context. And another context is, you look at this room of people, I assume a lot of people in this room are relatively new to Marxism, young people. So believe me, in Russia, when millions of people had joined the Marxist movement and for the first time going to Marxist circles, for study circles and so on. This is, people do need to read the so-called basics. So I think that was part of it too. But yeah, it does, because we have the 1920 statement about needing to study the whole of Plekhanov. We have the 1922 statements and 23 about Hegel and dialectics. I don't think these can be so easily combined. So I just see an ambivalent legacy, and I don't think it's strange to say that a political leader like Lenin would want to hold back certain things in a public or semi-public discourse. Marx himself, he says to Engels, he wrote the address, the inaugural meeting of the First International in 1864, and he writes to Engels, I had to insert some democratic phrases in there, because it's an organizational document, and Lenin is speaking as an organizational leader, not as a private academic, obviously. So I can't really, and certainly, well, Labriola is just a really, really important person, but I can't really debate on that. So, let's just leave it there. I hope, I'm gratified to see that people are interested in Lenin and Hegel and the dialectic, and I think with the revival or an interest in Lenin by a new generation is the people in this room are, in a sense, it's really up to you as to what happens with this stuff. Thank you.